Welcome to the Narrate podcast, where we aim to tell God's story with our lives. We'll be continuing to post the Sunday message each week, but we want to dive a little deeper and offer some content to supplement your life with God, and that's where our Beyond Sunday series comes in. Join Adam and Narrate staff as they provide thoughtful discussions, ideas, and interviews that go beyond the message you'll hear on Sunday. Hi, Narrate. It's Leslie. So before I took the worship position at Narrate, I worked in hospice bereavement, where I supported clients through grief just via individual sessions, groups, and events. I think I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for grief work, and with it being the holidays, our staff thought it might be a good idea to put out a conversation just about grief. So I asked Rebekah Orr, who is a local counselor and an owner at Narrate, if she would come on and chat with me. She's an amazing resource in our community, so I hope you find hope and resources in my conversation with Rebekah Orr. So I'm sitting here with Rebekah Orr. I get the privilege of talking with her, and it is really funny because I met Rebekah through the professional world of counseling, and I met her as Rebekah Orr, this like community counselor. And then I start going to Narrate church, and everybody's like, oh, there's this girl named Reba, and she sings like an angel, and she plays guitar, and she's so cool, Reba. And then I realize that's the same person. And I'm like, Rebekah, Reba, this is so cool.
I remember the first time we met face to face in Narrate, you were, I think, reading.
Yes, I remember.
And
that.
Adam was like, you have to meet this Leslie. And I didn't put it together at all because I'd never seen your face before. And I guess in my mind you were like a middle-aged woman.
Same.
From the way that
Same.
And so I was like, oh, so she's so cool. Look at this cool girl. And then I realized it was you.
Yes, it was like this pleasant,
yes,
missed identity thing.
And I was like, wait, we know each other.
We know each other. We've been communicating for years. So that was so I'm really, really excited to be able to just sit down and chat with you just about grief and about just all the things that you do professionally for people and for clients. And if you don't know Rebekah, she has a private practice here in Helena called Nature and Nurture. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so can you just start and tell us a little bit about just who you are professionally, maybe a little bit about your practice, what you're passionate about, helping people through grief. I know that's not the only thing you do in your practice, but give us a little background info.
For sure. So when I started counseling, practicing as a counselor, my specialty was perinatal mental health. And then a couple years ago, I walked along some friends who were navigating the grief that came with losing their child, and it really felt like a God thing. And I don't share this a lot because there's not really a space to in counseling to kind of talk about my own journey. But after their daughter had died, I got this random advertisement thing in the mail that was like, grief counseling certificate. And I was like, this feels really, I don't know. I don't always believe in coincidences. And so I just went through the training kind of casually, like how can I show up as a friend and as a resource to, our friends who are navigating this really hard thing. And I then decided to run my first holiday grief group. And this was back in 2022. And during the grief group, my Nana passed away, pretty suddenly. She was in her 90s, so, suddenly as someone in their 90s passed, but she was my best friend. And it was just really interesting, my experience of walking alongside other people navigating grief while also wrestling with my own, and that was kind of what started it wasn't something I chose necessarily. I feel like it more chose me. And so now what that looks like is I've kind of become the person in the community that works with perinatal grief and loss. And so a lot of my clients are navigating either pregnancy loss or infant loss or child loss. And so there's such a need for that it was a community and it was a thing that I was never really aware of until you're in it or someone you're close to is in it. And so, so I still do perinatal mental health, but a lot of, I would say almost half of my caseload now is moms with grief. Yeah.
Wow. And that just tells you like how needed that is in the community. I mean, that's pretty cool that you could pick up on that need, fill that need, provide that service for people. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. It just feels, it's always weird to think of like, oh, it's like a really successful business because it kind of sucks that that's what people are going through, right? That they're needing support in that. But I think a lot of that is, I don't know, it's been like a spiritual experience for me in the way that it wasn't something I chose. It really felt like something that God chose for me.
Right.
And there's so many experiences of my life that I feel like have paved the way of me being really comfortable talking about these really intense things, right? Very seldom in our society is there a space for someone to sit down and really share like what it was like to watch someone die.
So true.
And all of the processes around that. And I've had some personal experiences in my life where I've been present as people have, left this earth for another existence. And, it all feels purposeful in this season of my life.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think there is such a difference when it's a calling.
Yeah.
Right. Instead of just, I'm going to, buckle down and I'm going to go to school for this and and it's just like this path, but instead it's this calling that you felt God was leading you.
Yeah. Which I don't know how I would be able to power through.
It's a really intense job.
It is.
I would imagine that you walk with a lot of people through a lot of tough stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about grief, just in general, during the holidays. Why do you think it stings so much during the holidays? And it's just so kind of all-consuming this time of the year for people.
I found that there's so much connection to tradition around the holidays, and that usually is coming from some sort of family tie. And whether it's your own family's tradition and now that person is gone, right? And so you can't have your yearly gathering at that person's house anymore because they're not there. Or there's one less kid to put presents under the tree for. Or, Thanksgiving is a time where, there's grief besides just death too, like the grief of a relationship, or if someone's navigating divorce or separation from a relationship of a family member or whatever, right? It's like such a reminder of absence. And whether that's your own personal tradition or you're just surrounded by everyone else's gatherings, there's just so much of a reminder. Every movie you watch on TV, all of the TV show specials, everything you hear about is like, oh, who are you getting gifts for? Or where are you going to go for a party or have dinner with? And I just think that for individuals who are really navigating loss, it's really holds up a mirror. And then on the other side of that too, I think this expectation that this should be a joyful and happy time of year is really difficult if you are not feeling joyful and happy.
Yep, that is very true.
Like, it's the most wonderful time of the years. Joy and magic and
twinkling lights and hot chocolate.
Yes, and it really can be so difficult, especially if you're feeling pressured to show up a certain way. Or, I think it just really kind of holds up a mirror to the experience.
Yeah. And I think like there's almost no room for sadness or negative feelings during Christmas because it's happy, happy, joy, joy. And I feel like people who are grieving are feeling like they have to either hide that or isolate so that they can feel that. And we've talked a little bit about that, like moving into Advent too, that, there's this alternative, God leaves room for those feelings. It doesn't, I feel like there are a lot of stigmas that there is no room for. We can't tell God that we're mad and sad and, and grief.
I had always been familiar with Advent, but hadn't really practiced it until 2022, because that's also about the same time that I started going to Narrate. And what a relief.
A little bit more authentic. Yeah.
What a relief it was. I think too, there's a lot of shame that comes with, okay, I'm supposed to put on Christmas for my kids or my family or be there for my parents or whatever. And I'm going through the motions and I don't feel it. And I just, a lot of the clients that I work with are like, there's so much shame around that. I should be enjoying this, or I should be X, Y, and Z. And then on the other end, when they do start to enjoy it, it's like, oh, well, like maybe I shouldn't enjoy this because this person isn't here. There's just so, and I think a lot of that comes from this lack of space for us to talk about things or just name the complexities.
Right. Or be around other people who are also experiencing that like paradigm shift of like, I'm either not feeling this, being like disingenuine to myself, or I am feeling joyful and I shouldn't because I should be grieving, which is, that's the one I feel like people don't talk about as much, that I did go out with friends and laughed and had a great time and now I'm feeling guilty about it.
Yes. Or there's this fear of forgetting. I talk to a lot of individuals who are like, I'm afraid that moving forward means that I'm going to forget, and I mean, I think from an objective point of view, we can be like, no,
of course you won't.
Of course you won't. But there is a level of, integration that comes where it doesn't sting as much. And that sting, grief, and missing someone is still a form of connection to them.
Right.
Right? And so when we don't feel that, we start to feel disconnected, and that can feel really scary. There was a clip of Andrew Garfield on Sesame Street, and he was talking to Elmo about grief. He had lost his mom, and he was talking about how, like, missing his mom actually it's okay and it's a good thing because it makes him feel close to her. And I think that's really powerful and a good reminder for us, too, that, like, when we're walking alongside someone who is grieving, the point isn't necessarily for them to, like, feel better and be happy,
true.
Right?
So true.
Because we need that. Sometimes we need that missing. Sometimes we need that punch to the gut feeling to feel connected to that person and feel connected to the experience. And a lot of grief work is like moving away from the idea of good and bad feelings and more just recognizing that some are really uncomfortable, but that's not bad or wrong.
No. And if you sit in that, let yourself sit in that, it's actually way more, it moves through, you move through it quicker.
Yeah.
You feel more connected to that loss instead of just trying to push it away and push it down and get over it. And that was always some of my favorite moments with clients, is the like aha of, oh wait, grief isn't in stages. That's not a thing. They're like, now I'm in the like denial stage of grief, and now I'm in, I would have people come in and say, I think I'm in the anger phase of grief, and we kind of talk through like, well, actually, like, grief doesn't have stages. It's just everything all at once.
I could get real nerdy about how there's no research, and actually Kubler-Ross, who came up with the stages, was researching people who were diagnosed with terminal illness and their own reactions to their own mortality. She actually did no studies on the family members or the people affected.
And never meant it to be used for that.
But it's so interesting, especially, I'm going to speak, I guess, to our culture because I've never lived in another culture. But at least in our culture, we want there to be such a linear process, right? We want there to be an equation
that we can control.
Yes, we want to know what comes next, and we want to know we've achieved or accomplished, or we find value in that. And grief is just not the place there are some places in life where that is a wonderful approach, and grief is just, it is, yeah, it's not linear, and it's not cyclical either. It's just its own
thing,
really
own
messy process. And there is there's a couple illustrations of grief processes, I guess you could say, that I appreciate. And one being, there's this, it's like a kind of a diagram, and in one circle on the left is loss oriented.
Yes, the dual process model.
Yes,
this is
and
my
then
fave.
and then there's like what is it?
It's grief orientation, or I mean loss orientation and restoration.
Yes, restoration. That's the word. Yeah. And then there's this like really crazy arrow that like bounces back and forth between.
Yeah, so for the people listening, because you can't see this, it's like if you're picturing a Venn diagram, like the two circles, and then they overlap in the middle, and there's like a space in the middle. This is kind of what she's describing. So the one side is loss orientation, the other side is restoration orientation, and the crazy arrow is like this
in
idea
the space
that,
in between.
yes,
Yeah.
and that's your everyday life, right? Like you exist in that middle space.
And some days are more
bouncing.
loss oriented, and some days are more restorative, and some days are 50-50, and some days are, and I just I feel like that illustration gives a lot of, I mean, not that we need permission, but permission to just kind of exist in whatever shows up for us that day.
Yeah.
So that's one that I like. It's probably like my favorite illustration.
Yeah, that was some of the biggest ahas that I had gotten from people, that like the replacing the stages with that it's really freeing.
Yeah.
It's like, it's freeing and terrifying, right? Because like for people like me with, I like to be very structured and, kind of that anxiety vibe, like the idea of like checking off a phase, right? Like, oh, check, did that, moving on. Like there's something comforting in that. So when somebody would be like, oh yeah, well if somebody were to tell me, no, there is no order, no phase. It's just, you're just bouncing around.
This big, and it's scary. If you've never experienced, well, even if you have experienced grief, right? Because I feel like grief is this portal that then, if you've experienced grief, when you grieve again, it just reopens that portal, and like grief begets grief, and now we're grieving on top of our grief, because it is a journey, and it's something, I mean, there's that quote of grief is just love with nowhere to go, which I also really appreciate, because it is like, grief is the absence of something you care about, or that you existed in your life, or that doesn't just like go away.
Right.
You kind of, I mean, I don't mean this in like a doom and gloom way, but you grieve for the rest of your life, because that person or that relationship or whatever you're grieving, right, impacted you.
Right.
Now, the way that grief shows up might look different as it becomes more integrated in your day-to-day and in your experiences, but yeah, this whole thing of like there's an end point or there's like a finish line.
Not a thing.
Yeah, and it can feel really scary, especially for someone. I'm very similar, where I like to have a clear. I would love to have like check boxes.
Yes, just give me the answers.
Yeah, tell me the steps to get there.
Yes, I'll follow them perfectly
to the T. And so I think some of these illustrations can be helpful for people who have brains like ours, where it feels like when you're like, grief is just this big messy thing. It's like, okay, I'm just like out in the middle of the ocean with a life jacket on, barely keeping my head above the water, with no land in sight. Like, and that's what you're telling me I have to survive?
That is terrifying.
So.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's also kind of freeing that and validating that like there is no wrong thing that I'm feeling. There's no wrong face. It's okay that I ate chips for dinner for a week, and now I'm going to bump over to restoration orientation side and go hang out with some friends and, start a new hobby, and then I'm going to go back over to loss and visit the grave and cry, and it's all part of it. So, for people who are grieving, I mean, not just this time of the year, but just grieving in general, What are some good coping strategies to kind of wrap your head around?
I'm going to be frank and say I have a real love-hate relationship with the idea of coping strategies, because I think a lot of times they can just be like another, okay, like I'm going to check this box and feel better. So I will say some intention, maybe. There are definitely times and places where coping strategies, and there are types of people who like really need that structure. But kind of just reframing it as an intention, because too, then if you don't do it, there's less shame if it's an intention versus like something I'm supposed to be doing, right? Support is, I think, really paramount when I see people who are navigating grief and really struggling, and it becoming maybe something followed by like a depressive episode.
Right.
Where we're not just in the grief process anymore, but there is like some mental health decline outside of what I guess you could say is, I don't know, would fall under grief, are the people who don't have support, right? Mm-hmm. And who, and sometimes it's not their, because of anything they've done, they just don't have like the support available to them. So if you have support available to you, leaning into that. Secondly, like really having an intention of self-compassion. I mean, that's really recognizing that, especially early in that grief journey, holding yourself to an expectation of like what life was like before.
Right.
Thinking that you should be as productive, or in some ways, I think that having some of that time to, I think we see it as like falling apart, but it's like honoring that relationship, right? Honoring that loss and having some space and time around. We allow ourselves time around anything else, right? We allow a honeymoon.
Right.
After a marriage. We're getting better at allowing mothers to have some space postpartum, right? We're still a long way to go, but we're starting to recognize that that's a big life change, right? And that they need support, and we show up and we bring dinners and we, allow them to have all the feelings that they need to feel. And retirement, big life change, right? There's like space for that. And I think that with grieving, it's another big life change, and sometimes someone needs to just get back in their routine for their own well-being, and that's fine. I'm not saying anything about like you should take time off work or X, Y, and Z. It's so individualized, but really giving yourself that self-compassion that, just you might not be showing up in the same way that you were before, and that's not a bad thing. It might be uncomfortable,
right?
But
that is true.
In a way, like you're a new person. You have
this
new experience.
Absolutely. You're a totally new person.
Yeah.
Now. So it makes sense that your life would be different. It would look different.
And the most concrete, I guess you could say, coping skill is, and this is like a boring thing to talk about, but basic needs.
Well, it's so true though. When you're grieving, I mean, that's the hard stuff, right?
Put something in your body.
Yeah.
I don't care if it's a bag of chips.
Yep. And some water.
And some water. Yeah, drink water. Please drink water. Please eat something. Please sleep, and please get some sunshine, right? Yeah. Those basic needs, there is with any client in counseling, if someone's not meeting those basic needs, I'm going to be like, we're going to waste a lot of time sitting here and talking about your childhood issues if you're not sleeping.
Yes.
Yes, it's,
absolutely.
So if that's all you can do, that's enough.
Yep.
If that's all you can do is feed yourself a couple times a day and drink water and just show up to the things you have to show up to, you're doing a great job.
It is really true. And I think just that gentle reminder of that, like that is enough. That is plenty. That's really true. So then what would you say to the person who wants support, they recognize it's important, but it's the struggling to get out of the isolation bubble, right? Like people are inviting them out and checking in, but they just want to be in their own little bubble. How do you break out of that?
I just tell clients, you can always leave. We get so...
That's what I would say, too.
We get so caught up, and if I have to do it, I have to do it all the way.
Right. When I gotta stay for 5 hours, and I
have to stay till the end, or if I'm just gonna say, maybe someone invites you to the movie, right? Like, I go to the movie, I have to stay till the end of the movie. No, you don't.
You can get up and leave.
You can get
Sorry,
up and
I gotta go
leave.
home.
Yes. And this is when, and it's sometimes a hard conversation. And again, grief is so individualized, so I have a difficult time like making general statements here and thinking that it applies to everyone. So anyone listening, if it doesn't apply to you, then that's okay. But I just think that when we have these friendships and we put so much pressure that like we have to show up a certain way, it puts pressure on them that they have to also show up a certain way. I have so many clients who have walked through grief, and it's deepened their relationships when they have had the opportunity to show up authentically in where they're at. And I'm just gonna say, like, again, using this movie, I don't know, example. If you go to the movies with someone and you can't do it, you get even through the previews and you're like, nope, I gotta go. And if they're upset about that, do you want to be hanging with them?
Probably not the best support.
Yeah, I'm not saying you can't have a relationship with that person, but maybe we need to, really look at boundaries and like what that relationship is in the season of your life, and that's okay too, right? And I think, again, there's just we live in such like a rigid, defined, labeled, all or nothing existence in this society, and grief just comes in and it is above culture. It is above it is above all of those like labels or way of doing things, and it can be the greatest teacher if we're willing and able to be a student of it. In learning how to show up for ourselves and advocate for ourselves and show up for our friends and family and be true to ourselves. And it can deepen our spiritual relationship. It can deepen our relationship with God. And what I mean by deepen doesn't always mean like we feel good. Sometimes we're really angry with people, and that is deepening the relationship.
Yep, that is a really, really important distinction. So what do you say to the person that says, I'm so angry at God?
That he can take it? You're not the first one.
Right, he's got big shoulders. I think your anger is not too big for our God. I mean, that's very true.
I think my experience, I just think he welcomes it. He knows. Right. Whether we sit there and we, pray in our anger or we swallow, like, he knows whether we acknowledge it or not. And walking alongside my friend who lost their daughter, and her experience of wrestling with faith, and how, I don't know, I had more respect for her in some ways with that, because it's scary. It's like any, suddenly you're questioning the whole way of the universe. Like, are you there? Are you good? Like, maybe there is a God, but is he a good God? And my own wrestle with that of, it seems super unjust for a child to die. Like, that doesn't seem right. And I don't feel like he's left me. I mean, I said some kind of mean things to him, and he still stuck around, forgave me, and our relationship is deeper on the other side. And I think that's what I mean by whether it be a relationship with God or a relationship with friends, and these conflicts, and just like with if you're married and you have a healthy conflict with your partner, how on the other end there's more understanding, right? Disagreements done in a healthy and constructive way lead to deepening relationships. I mean, we tend to feel closer to our friends when we go through a hard thing together, right? Yeah. And I think the same is with God. I mean, he doesn't expect for us to be, I just don't think that he expects for us to be like, oh, okay, this is fine.
Yeah.
There's no expectation of that. There's no pressure to show up that way from God.
Right.
There might be from society, and there might even be some from church.
Yeah.
But I don't see anywhere in Scripture where he's like, okay, if you lose someone, you still have to show up and
right,
joyfully,
in the same capacity that you did before,
joyfully praise my name and tell me how great I am. Like, I don't see that anywhere in scripture.
Right.
I actually see the opposite. I see people being really angry and
lamenting.
There's a whole book on lamenting.
Yes.
You know, there's so many Psalms about how like suffering exists. Like,
God's turned his back on me. And
yes.
Yeah.
That's what it's like. You're not the first one, and I just think God expects it. I also have so many thoughts on like, I mean, my own beliefs on like what God's plan is and what intention is for the world, and that the world was created to be without sin and without death. And so his intention was never for us to experience these things. I think he mourns with us, right? Like, I don't know. Sometimes I mean, sin is the reason death exists anyway. And so I'm going to sit here and say God's probably angry with you. That's the reality of the situation, right? And that was probably the biggest like catalyst for a deepening relationship with him, through my own grief of I had my own grief around my friends losing their daughter, and that was the biggest thing of like, oh, wait a minute, like, what if he's actually angry with me?
Yeah, that's a really comforting and different mindset than a lot of people talk about.
Yeah. There's this Billy Graham book about why the world, I don't know, about suffering. And he paints this picture of that if you can imagine that you are on the top of a mountain and you're looking down, and there's a windy road, and there are two cars coming at each other, and you can see that they're about to collide, but like, you don't have full control over the steering wheel, right? You can yell at them, you can send them signals, right? But they have free will.
Right.
And how painful it must be for you to witness what just occurred. And sometimes I think of that when we talk about like God's omnipotence and things like that, of like, okay, but he also did give us free will and let go of the reins a little bit. And so that picture comes to mind when things like this happen, of like, oh, that must break his heart. And I think about Jesus weeping when Lazarus dies, right? And for a long time I didn't understand, like, bring it back to life. Like, why are you
sad? Yeah.
But there's a part of me, and again, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't in Jesus's head, but there's a part of me that wonders if he recognizes, like, this is what we all go through. And not everybody gets brought back to life. Like, in this situation, yes, but I don't know, him being present with, wow, like, this really is painful.
Right.
So,
well, I think, too, the time that he spent being true man, like, he experienced those feelings, too, you know? He can ultimately empathize with us as humans because he was one, which is that is really comforting. It's not just some big God on a hill, looking down at some distant beings.
It's complicated, and I think the biggest comfort is recognizing I'm not gonna know.
Yeah.
That might be really, and I was really uncomfortable with that for a long time, but I mean, God would be a pretty small God if I could understand everything.
Yeah.
And I don't. And so, yeah, I think part of this grief work that I have felt called to do is really wrestling, coming alongside individuals as they're wrestling with things and sitting in the discomfort of the unknown, and just validating that, like, I don't have an answer. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I have an answer like so many people do.
Yeah.
It's the least helpful when someone just gives out some Bible verse or some
platitude.
Yes. Or some, well, they're in a better place now, or they're not suffering any longer, or
you can have another baby.
Yes. And in a way that's trying to give an answer to a question that wasn't asked.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And I think that's why those kind of platitudes and, things like that hurt so much for a griever. is because, like, you can feel that. That's not, I didn't ask that question. I don't want that answer. It's really, like, offensive almost.
It's very cold and detached.
Yeah.
And it often has, something to do with our own discomfort. The person offering the platitude, it's discomfort of the situation. And often those things are said and not maliciously. They're said in good intention.
Right.
And we just live in a society that is very detached from death. Most funeral practices you don't really see the body after the person dies and until they're prettied up, right? Or you don't see them at all.
Yeah.
And I'm not here to say good, bad, pull any judgments, but, like, the reality is that there is a detachment that comes from that. And when there's unknown, that's where anxiety and discomfort comes from, right? And so when someone hasn't gone through something similar, or maybe they weren't supported in their grief journey, then when someone else is grieving, it's very hard for them to show up. Yeah. And so instead, it's easier to give some form of, okay, I'm acknowledging this, but I'm going to stay at an arm's length because if your grief feels a little bit contagious to me,
right?
I'm afraid to get too close.
That's
and so
the attitude that it feels like too. It's it feels like people think you're going to get it on them.
Yes. And I really want to bring a sense of compassion towards, they're not the bad guys because they throw out a platitude or they say the wrong thing, because very seldomly, if ever, have I heard someone say something out of, malicious intent.
Right.
Like that. So usually when I'm walking with clients through that too, I'm like, okay, yeah, that hurt. Both and, right? It both really hurt and was really unhelpful. And we don't have to take it personally because it probably has nothing to do with you anyway. It probably has to do with their own stuff that they're trying to navigate through.
Yep. Very true.
Yeah.
More about them than it is about you. So if you could say something to people who are supporting people in grief, what are some of the kindest things you can do for people who are grieving if you're walking with someone?
Yeah. 3 things come to mind. The first, show up 2 months later. After the funeral is over, or after the divorce papers are signed, and everyone's life keeps moving. That person's life is not moving as fast as everyone else's now. And at that beginning phase, there is usually a lot of support. We have a lot of ritual and a lot of... Often the brain is a little bit in shock during that time too. And it tends to be 2-3 months later when the first of some sort of holiday or event comes up. And that's when those people need support.
That's so true. I remember this gal that I talked to, she had lost her husband, and she, it was like the funeral, the people, they sent cards and they called, and, she had friends come stay at her house, and then, it was about a couple months later and all that stuff kind of faded off, and she was feeling good. She was totally fine. But the thing that moment for her was she took the last roll of paper towels from the Costco run that her and her husband would do together. And then it just snapped for her. It hit her in that moment. And it doesn't even have to be a holiday. It doesn't have to be like the anniversary of the death. It can be the roll of paper towels.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It can be the reminder for your annual doctor's appointment that you didn't turn off after that person died, and suddenly you're getting a text message about, or an email about your kiddo's well check, you know? Sometimes these things take time too, as far as like getting the death certificate. That's not immediate.
Right.
And there's just these things that come up, these triggers, as you will, and there tends to be a lot of people around and a lot of community supports, even from like hospice or the hospital or the funeral home at that beginning. But a few months in, those things start to kind of strip away unless that person is reaching out for them. And I think sometimes it's really unfair that we make that person reach out, because we know that grief tends to coincide with feelings of isolation, right? So that's my first one. My second one being say the name of the person who died. We often are so afraid of upsetting someone. And now, if you don't know this person well, I don't know if I would walk up to them and be like, you know, true. But if you're close to them, if you're walking, like, if you're doing life together, right? If you think of that person, send them the message that you're thinking of them. Or maybe have an authentic conversation with them of like, hey, this person, you know, so-and-so's been on my mind, and I'd love to share with you when that happens. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah.
Right? Kind of asking for that consent of, hey, can I bring this up with you? And I want to say often the answer is yes. Now, there are certain situations where that might be really painful for them, but especially with working with parents who've lost their child, like their child still is in their family.
Right.
Just as much as their other children are in their family. And so saying their name or sharing with them stories or memories that you have of that person and speaking of it not in a sad way.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the way that we talk about any memory that we have of our friends' children or parents or siblings or whatever, right? It's like cold water on a hot day sometimes, right?
It's a gift for that person. Yeah. And I think, too, the person who's grieving, they are thinking about that person or the situation or whatever all the time. Yeah. So it's like they're just walking around with this in their mind at all times. And if you ask them about it, it's like most people would love to talk about it and talk about the person or the situation, because it's all they're thinking about anyways, you know. It's right there at the surface for them.
My third thing is don't give up on that person. They're going to say no to most of your invitations for a while, or they likely are going to say no to invitations to things for a while, or they might, if and when they do show up, not be the most joyful. They might not. Some people, I mean, again, there's no right way to grieve, and so some people really don't want to publicly grieve, and that's okay. That's totally fine, right? Some people need that routine of showing up to the things and doing the things and engaging the things, and that's great. It's also great if you are in the boat of, I don't want to do things and I don't want life to go back to normal, because life is never going to be normal again. And for friends or family of people in that second boat, keep inviting them. I think that in other situations, a lot of times if we get no's, we're like, okay, you're not interested. I'm not going to like... Right.
I'm going to take that personally a little bit.
Yeah, or I'm like not going to push it because it's awkward when you... If you're like inviting someone and...
They've said no 6 times.
No 6 times. You're like, am I being a little pushy? And don't take it personally if they say no. Don't take it personally if they say yes, but then don't come. Or if they leave... Right? Allowing some flexibility and compassion there, but don't give up on them. It might be a year, it might be 3 years, but there's something really important about still being included in the world, even if you aren't ready to engage. Having the invitation, knowing someone thought about you. Right. Knowing someone still wants to be around you, even though you are a hot mess.
Right, or a cloud of gray. And,
totally.
Yeah. Another one that comes to mind for me is just being with them. Like silence, right? Like just your presence. You don't need to fill it. Right? You don't have anything to say anyways. You know what I mean?
You can't fix it.
No, yeah. So.
unless you know how to bring someone back.
Right.
Or rewind time.
Yeah. So just that come over and sit with them, watch a movie, go for a walk, and don't say anything. You know, and I think it kind of goes back to that. Somebody wants to be in my presence, even though I'm sad and
right.
You know?
And I'm allowed to show up as is, right? Someone who has lost a child or had a pregnancy loss and then going over to their friend's house who just had a baby and feeling pressure to show up a certain way, that's hard.
Right.
And acknowledging the hard.
Yeah.
Being with that person and acknowledging the hard and just accepting, you know, most people are just trying to do their best most of the time.
That's very true. And that's good to remember for the griever, right? Like,
Yeah.
people don't mean to be, you know, hurtful on purpose most of the time.
Yeah.
Rarely.
Doesn't make it okay if they say something
Right.
hurtful, right? We can approve of, or we can accept something without approving of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Anything else you want to share? Grief support wise for yourself, for supporters of those grieving?
You're not alone in your grief. It's something that we don't have a lot of space for.
True.
And so it can feel really isolating. But you are not alone. Your story is unique. Your experience is unique, just like you are unique. But there are so many people that are navigating similar situations who have a level of understanding. And if you can muster up any ounce of strength or willpower and just try, if there's like a community event, right, or a group, or just try, knowing you can leave. If it's not a good fit or whatever, you can leave. But it's just sometimes really, I mean, from my own personal experience, just so really reassuring that I'm not the only one who's ever been really angry in my grief, right? I think as a woman, too, just being angry in general, that's hard.
Right.
But being around other people who have experienced grief and who have experienced anger and been like, yeah, I get it,
Right.
is sometimes the most healing thing, right? It's not a fix. It's just like, oh, whew, okay, not just me.
You're not the only one.
Yeah. So whether or not you are showing up like actually in a space with other people, or you just hear my words of you are not alone in your grief and whatever you're feeling is okay. It's acceptable. It might be hard or uncomfortable, but it's not bad.
Right.
And it doesn't ever go away, but it does get easier to like carry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How can people find your practice, connect with you, hear more from you?
I have a website. It's natureandnurturemontana.com. That's probably the easiest to see information. I do, part of what I do, I'm passionate about my practice is education. So I have counseling interns and